Sí. 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 Hola a todas, a todos, muy bienvenidos y gracias por estar acá. Para nosotros, en Democracia UDP, Facultad de Ciencias Sociales y Historia y la Facultad de Comunicaciones y Letras, es un gusto y un orgullo tener conversando con nosotros hoy día al periodista Alexander Heffner. Él es norteamericano, periodista y conductor del programa Open Mind y autor de un libro que fue muy leído, llamado Documentary History of the United States. Lo tenemos invitado hoy día y nos da mucho gusto tenerlo acá, justamente porque Estados Unidos está viviendo un momento de especial tensión en lo que se refiere al tema de la democracia. Eso va a ser de lo que Alexander nos va a hablar hoy día. ¿En qué está la democracia, la libertad de expresión en Estados Unidos? En tiempos en que hemos visto intentos de censuras a periodistas que trabajan allá, en tiempos en que están habiendo tensiones de tal nivel que han habido asesinatos políticos, etc. Para presentar a Alexander y para conducir de alguna manera este momento que después tendrá también la oportunidad de ustedes de hacer preguntas a nuestro invitado, va a tomar la palabra Rosana Castiglione, que es justamente la directora de la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales e Historia. Así que Rosana va a presentar a Alexander y llevar adelante esta conferencia. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Patricio. Voy a poner esto acá. Ahora sí, ¿se escucha bien? Sí. Buenos días, ¿cómo están? Bien, miren, quienes no, esta conferencia va a ser en inglés, así que si quieren traducción simultánea, tienen que salir y pedir uno de los aparatitos para poder escuchar la traducción. ¿Okay? Deben dejar su evidencia eso. Ok. Vamos a partir entonces. Estados Unidos está atravesando profundos cambios económicos, sociales, políticos, que remiten a sus propias raíces históricas e incluso a elementos nacionales. Hace no tanto, Ronald Reagan, expresidente de los Estados Unidos, republicano, defendía las bondades de la llamada Reaganomics. Okay. Políticas orientadas al libre mercado, a la desregularización de la economía, al crecimiento económico, a la reducción del gasto público social. Pero sobre todo a la no intervención estatal en asuntos económicos. En estos últimos meses, además, se volvió viral un video, que fue el video de despedida, el discurso de despedida del presidente Reagan cuando dejó su cargo, y en el que decía: puedes vivir en Francia, pero no puedes ser francés; puedes vivir en Alemania, Turquía o Japón, pero no puedes convertirte en alemán, turco o japonés. Pero cualquiera, de cualquier rincón del mundo, puede venir a Estados Unidos y convertirse en estadounidense. Hoy, sin embargo, esos pilares propios de la cultura estadounidense y del llamado sueño americano, el American Dream, parecen estar en entredicho. La economía se ha vuelto más proteccionista, digamos, tal vez lo más proteccionista en las últimas décadas. El nativismo y el sentimiento antimigrante han ganado terreno, y principios claves de la democracia estadounidense, como la libertad de expresión, están hoy en el centro del debate. En este contexto, la visita de Alexander Heffner a la Universidad de Diego Portales resulta tremendamente oportuna. Muchos de nosotros queremos comprender las causas de estos cambios, sus posibles alcances y, sobre todo, reflexionar sobre el estado actual de la democracia estadounidense. Alexander Heffner es un reconocido presentador del programa The Open Mind en PBS y autor de un libro que es bestseller, que coautorió con su abuelo, me enteré, titulado Una historia documental de los Estados Unidos. Además es historiador, con lo cual está plenamente capacitado para seguir el legado de su abuelo en este libro. Sus preocupaciones giran en torno a cómo reconstruir la confianza cívica y superar la división, la desinformación y las burbujas del filtro digital. Y en una serie que también condujo de Breaking Bread with Alexander, que fue emitida por Bloomberg TV, realizó entrevistas documentales con líderes estadounidenses y mundiales, explorando el estado de la vida cívica, la libertad de expresión y el aprendizaje a través de las diferencias políticas. Hoy, en un contexto marcado por la segunda administración del presidente Trump, las amenazas a los derechos humanos y la inestabilidad geopolítica, Heffner se pregunta cuáles son las soluciones a esta disfunción y discordia. ¿Cómo puede nuestra huella social transformarse en deliberación constructiva, consenso y compromiso, en lugar de confrontación destructiva? ¿Qué pueden hacer la ciudadanía, el gobierno, las plataformas tecnológicas y la prensa para tender puentes y restaurar la integridad en las políticas públicas? Entonces estamos sumamente expectantes a las respuestas que Alexander nos pueda dar, así que sin más preámbulos, les dejo con Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, let me apologize to everyone in this room because this was 10 or 15 years ago. You might not need to do this translation, but my Spanish is a bit rusty. So for the purpose of transparency and this exchange of ideas, I think my English is more sufficient than my Spanish. Thank you to the Dean. Thank you to the community. You clearly have a lively and energetic community of learners, educators, and people who care about civil society. So let me dive right into the state of the United States, the condition of our democracy. You probably follow the news, whether it's on your device or on the television or on a social media platform, but you follow it enough to understand, as the Dean said, that there is tumultuousness, there's tumult in America. And I want to excavate that a bit, unearth what the origins are of what we might call the discontent in the United States. And then I'm very excited to answer your questions and also possibly ask you questions too in the Q&A section and learn what's on your mind, your consciousness about the future of democracy. One of the things that's noteworthy whenever I visit a new place is to really immerse myself. This is my first time here in a professional context, but as I was traveling through your customs, security, and meeting people on the street, it was worth acknowledging that in the 1970s, what we were experiencing as a country was a scandal called Watergate. You probably read about it on Wikipedia. You can find it in an American history textbook. But it was the investigation into the corruption and the documentation of the corruption of President Nixon. And there's, I'm not going to go through the entire lesson of what Nixon was involved in, but suffice to say, he was engaged in spying on his political opponents without their consent, breaking into the office of the opposition party, an activity that we would consider criminal outside of the political sphere, that we would just consider inherently criminal. A little bit before that time, what you all experienced, your parents, grandparents, siblings, friends, who were perhaps older than you, born in an earlier time than you all, was manifestations of something more nefarious, political violence. So an agenda of a politician or a military leader that translated into disappearances and murders. And while the number I know is disputed in terms of the scope of that violence, these events were occurring not quite simultaneously, but around the same sphere. But the difference between Watergate and a coup d'etat that led to the murders of people in the National Stadium is that one was a corruption scandal that did not involve assassinations and the citizenry's dying, individuals dying. And as we reflect on where we are entering in the American political context, we don't have the memory that Chileans have of a period when it wasn't merely discourse or law breaking, but actual harm to individual humans, injury and death to individual people in the community. And that's an important distinction to draw. So I want to give you a bit more of a landscape analysis of my perspective on how the discourse in America has become increasingly divisive. But I also want to stand here today and tell you something with confidence, which is the instances of that have been attributed to political violence in the United States in the last few months. As a journalist and as a human being, I consider them the acts of mentally unhinged people, whether that is the assassination of a legislative leader in the state of Minnesota, a Democratic leader, or the assassination, I would even use the term the murder. Assassination does often imply a political connotation. So the murder of the state leader in Minnesota, the Democrat, the murder of a Trump advisor, Charlie Kirk, these were murders. I consider them to be done by unhinged people, mentally ill people, and that's what I consider them as an objective reality. The decaying of our discourse in the political sphere, that has been a long-standing tradition of separating ideas, right? So that conservatives only talk to each other and liberals only talk to each other. How did it get this way? In my mind, that requires a solution. But it's not the same solution to a mental health crisis of individuals, a small number of individuals, or their ability to access weaponry. I just want to stand here and very explicitly differentiate between those things, right? Because I do not fear, as an American, an escalation of violence like what happened with the Pinochet coup d'etat regime. I do not fear that at this moment. But I do fear that if we continue to tolerate the weaponization of our political discourse into not just a theater of the absurd, there's a lot of absurdity in American political life, starting with the idea that a celebrity TV host can just stand in and become president. But the unreasonableness of the political system is a reality. The rationality of our people is something I continue to have confidence in. One of the things that I've thought about for many years since President Trump came onto the scene was how can someone speak this way on Twitter, now X, and how can the American people behave so normally in the streets, right? There's clearly this disconnect between authoritarian rhetoric and the, if you want to say, normal or mature behavior of the citizenry. If you want to understand the divisiveness, though, I think you start with the point that Americans have had political consultants who have bred a culture of groupthink, homogeneous thinking, and in our respective legislative branch, right, in the United States, the system has devolved into where the person running picks the pool of voters. The pool of voters don't decide from a diverse spectrum of parties or individuals, but because of gerrymandering, increasingly in the United States, a concept by which a pool of voters in a given constituency become unilaterally liberal or conservative or only favor one idea. That is so much the germane origin of the dysfunction in the American political process that enabled politicians of both parties to exploit the idea that people are only getting their news from one channel and only believing one politician or one set of politicians. And social media came into play over the last decade plus and basically took that model of gerrymandering and put it on steroids and said, you think you're divided now? Well, you'll just wait and see, because we're gonna make you the most extremist in the discourse and delude everyone on social media into believing that these memes that insult people individually are indicative of how our town halls operate, how the mayor engages with local communities. But it's not. That's a social media phenomenon. If you want to get elected to Congress or mayor or be the fire department chief, you actually have to engage with people with your boots on the ground in a rational, reasonable, respectful way. And I'm here to tell you that that practice still goes on in the United States. The framers of our Constitution came up with a system that's called federalism. It's been practiced here and in a host of other countries for many decades and years. In America, cities and states continue to operate in many respects independently of the Trump administration. Yes, the Trump administration has increasingly defunded federal subsidies or investments in those cities or states, especially ones with Democratic leaders. He's a Republican leader. But the reality, plain to see in the American political life right now is that life goes on. And the divisiveness is something that can be confronted. Understanding its origin through political consultants feeding into a frenzied cycle of bigotry is the way to best understand it. So I've thought about it in the context of bigotry, obstruction, and dysfunction. And I think it's a deadly disease, really, when you have a political life that incentivizes a vicious cycle of those things. Bigotry, obstruction, and dysfunction. I mean, doesn't that seem like a logical flow to the end of civilization? I mean, doesn't that seem like a way that politics just doesn't work anymore, or people are led to believe that? So each of us, as Americans, as journalists, as policy makers and advocates, have a responsibility to understand, how did we get to a point where our politics became so bigoted that we didn't want to engage with communities that might be different if you're from the country and you can't engage with people in the city or vice versa. And I think that is what is going on in America is the people who want to fix the problem are doing the soul searching right now and understanding that vicious cycle and how to change the incentive structure, whether it's political donations or the way that a president's cabinet operates or the way that caucus leaders elect Democratic or Republican representatives to their respective parties, figuring out solutions to this problem of the divisiveness of the rhetoric. And again, this has to be done now that President Trump is in his second term, independent of a significant figure who exploits that very problem of the divisiveness, who doesn't wake up every morning thinking about, well, America is not united, or America is struggling with unification and its morale. That's not how President Trump wakes up. To the Dean's point, I genuinely believe that President Reagan, President Bush, President Clinton, President Obama, these are people who woke up and at the very least, they didn't say, how can I rabble rouse today? At the very least, they didn't say, what mischief can I get in today? How can I upset people today? I mean, and I would even give those predecessors credit in saying that their dialogue was infinitely different. The only president who compares to President Trump, I've said this many times since President Trump ran in 2015, the only discourse that is remotely comparable from a United States president or even a high-profile candidate for the presidency would be Andrew Jackson and Andrew Johnson. And you can Google those figures and look at them up on Wikipedia. And if you read their biographies, you can see statements that they said during their tenures that were pointedly similar to President Trump in terms of how they antagonized their opposition. And otherwise, for decades, we had presidents who woke up saying, how can I reassure our country that we are one United States as a whole? Even while I may espouse convictions that may be disagreeable or conflict with a certain constituency or set of constituencies in the country, how can I still present myself in a way that's going to preserve or increase the morale? And so I'll just tell you briefly how I, as an American journalist, have endeavored to do that over the last few years with a series that the Dean alluded to called Breaking Bread. So you know probably the biblical idea of bread breaking. And it's a concept that's been retraced in religious texts, but it's also one that has secular application, the idea of sharing a meal with someone. And often in the context of politics, breaking bread is meant, let's have a meal over our differences and find common ground. And so that's what I endeavor to do with elected officials in the United States at the highest level. People like Senator John Thune, who's the majority leader of the Republicans, and the most important leader outside of President Trump to enact the administration's agenda. That's what I did with Senator Cory Booker. I also spoke with governors when he was in the governor's office, the state of North Dakota, Governor Doug Burgum, who's now the Interior Minister of the United States. Governor Wes Moore, more recently in the state of Maryland. And so I invited them, or invited myself, to have a meal with them. Depending on the circumstance, some of them said, oh, why don't you come to the baseball game at Camden Yards, where the Orioles play. But the point is, we've lost the semblance of humanity in our political life, and I wanted to increase and repopulate that humanity in the way that I was dealing with these electeds. Not from an adversarial position that I think that they are engaged in corruption or wrongdoing, but that they have a platform to increase the domestic tranquility, a term from our founding text as Americans, increase the frequency of our tranquility, the reliability of our tranquility. And I think everyone who participated in 2 seasons that were on television on PBS and Bloomberg, 2 stations, one of which you can access quite readily here, Bloomberg TV. The output was, I think, enormous interest in that soul searching that I identified before, and also how we can not just disagree agreeably, or the term has come to fruition, disagree better, but how we can find common values and bonds to progress. And I think that disagreeing better is important. Don't get me wrong. Can disagreeing itself sustain a union or a republic or a diverse and pluralistic society? I don't know if we only have disagreements and there's no incentive to find commonalities. So I want to challenge our electeds now in the wake of the murders of Charlie Kirk and Melissa Hortman and others to say we're going to disagree better as politicians. We're going to also find areas for common ground, whether that's infrastructure projects to improve waterways or airports, or whether that's just saying we're going to stop politicizing murders, or whether that's a consensus between Republicans and Democrats that the epidemic of gun violence in the United States is wrong. And now Republicans and Democrats are both public figures of all ilks are vulnerable to mentally ill people having their hands on weapons and committing atrocities. And so there are potential areas of common ground, and the question is, will we find them? So I want to give one example from the Breaking Bread series that's pretty dear to my heart. And it's something that came up in a few different episodes, one in particular with the governor of New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham. One of the things we talked about was the fact that when we, as Americans, pay our taxes, which comes in April every year, we don't do so in a way that reflects our knowledge of what those taxes are going towards, what those taxes are investing in. And if we want to be patriotic and wave a flag, we can. But if we want to actually be informed and have our patriotism be substantiated in what the government is doing or not doing, then we need to be engaged in the actual knowledge of what our taxpayer dollars are going towards. It's actually a very conservative principle to ensure transparency and accountability. And most Americans, if you want to take my word for it, they hold their nose. Maybe they do their account themselves, they pay their taxes themselves, or maybe they hire an accountant. And as soon as that day comes, and sort of as soon as they know they've delivered the taxes, they don't want to hear about it again. And having that kind of destructive relationship with what is, in my mind, the cornerstone of republicanism, of representing the ideas of the public in legislative deed and policies, and that you just want to get as far away from possible as tax day and not have knowledge of. I understand it's painful to pay taxes, but it's doubly painful when you have your neighbors over for dinner and you don't know, what is servicing the community, what resources are there to fill a pothole or to clean a stream or to educate students in the classroom. I think we want to be empowered with the information of taxpaying. So in my conversation with Governor Lujan Grisham of New Mexico and several other governors and senators, I imparted this idea, and there was a consensus among Republicans and Democrats that we need to be more cognizant of where those funds are going, but we also need to develop tools like an Amazon.com, basically, for an easy digital registry where you can understand when you're paying your municipal, state, or federal taxes, where are those dollars going? What community are they serving, whether it's the fire department, police department, or improving an infrastructure of an airport or a bridge? Americans are not engaged in those conversations. Maybe you and your communities are, and bless your hearts if you are. Maybe those vehicles for active, deliberative, democratic learning, if you want to call it that, exist in what is a developed democracy, albeit a younger one than the United States. I think in far too many countries that consider themselves developed democracies, those vehicles for learning about municipal decisions and being able to access digitally, because that's, I see everybody's device, their phone sitting here. I think that we are being exploited by the social media companies and refusing to imagine whether it's nonprofits or for-profit entities that can make democracy more resilient, more informed, and work better for people. And I think that we as a citizenry or as citizenries of the world are just not challenging ourselves to do that. I do it on a very small scale in the way that I engage with these electeds and want to show them you don't have to go on the most ideological television platform where you're supposed to preach an agenda that is anti-whatever, right, or pro-whatever. I want to have real dialogues that are not stuck in that kind of ideological framework of you can only appease or appeal to one single audience. But then there comes the work of actually learning. And so, to me, if there was, I could wave my magic wand, I think I would institute or endeavor to implement a learning apparatus about our democracy before censoring anyone, before regulating speech, before shutting off the platforms that we consider now to be disruptive in many respects, like an X or a Facebook. I would say, well, what are the alternatives? Can't we imagine alternatives, especially in the process of democratic governing? I understand why this question wouldn't arise in North Korea, or China or Russia for that matter. But why are we not evaluating it and looking in the mirror and saying, you know, the way that we're monolithically behaving in these social media platforms or engaging in political discourse without accountability, without transparency, eventually that's going to result in that last stage of the vicious cycle that I mentioned in a conclusive way, not in an ad hoc way. What I alluded to, the dysfunction and the obstruction, they're going to be the dominant features of our society that have been digitized in such extraordinary ways. If we don't pick up our device and say, oh, here's an app that I'm going to look to see, you know, there's many of you may have heard of the Citizen app that exists in some countries in the US, but an app to see, how's my democracy going? How's, you know, when I was outside my hotel this morning, I saw the garbage, there's 3 or 4 garbage bins, right? And I was wondering, how's the mayor doing, right? Then about 2 minutes later, I saw the garbage truck pick them up right on time, right? And so there's this instinctive desire on social media to punish the other, to otherize, to expose malfeasance. Okay, maybe there is a place for investigative journalism online, and certainly exposing things we could not expose before we all were citizen journalists in effect. But at the same time, you know, when we have all these sophisticated mechanisms on our phone to do all these kinds of things, why isn't there a way to be informed and constructive and responsible in our citizenship? Remains to be clear, remains to be seen. Why that hasn't evolved, but in these conversations with the elected leaders that I mentioned, this was an important point. I'll just conclude with an anecdote, and it's become a bit cliche in the American political scene, but because this is not an American audience, and I still firmly believe in what I'm about to say, and I think everybody should, I think it's important. Because fundamentally, when we talk about that vicious cycle of bigotry, obstruction, and dysfunction, it means if you are incentivized to be bigoted or to obstruct politics, to misinform people or disinform people, you're not going to have the ultimate outcome you want. So it was only however many years ago, when I started my career in political journalism, there was an election, the 2008 presidential election. And if you've heard this story, forgive me, I'll tell you one more time. If you haven't, I hope it will be something that is absorbed in you when you think about American politics going forward. You have Barack Obama, charismatic young senator from the state of Illinois. You had war hero John McCain, longtime, well-liked across the aisle, across the political spectrum. A lot of supporters from Arizona, Democrats, Republicans, Independents. In that campaign, there was something unusual, was the fact that you had your first major party nominee who was not white, the black man, Barack Obama. And you may or may not know this, but there were emails that circulated, much like the way social media can feed a lot of disinformation. Emails challenging the authenticity of then Senator Obama's citizenship, pass this on, and these channels existed. They weren't publicized by NBC News or other stations, and social media didn't exist in that way. It was kind of a quiet smear campaign that was ongoing. And at one of his events, Senator McCain, the Republican again, Obama, the Democrat reigns, McCain, the Republican, both people well liked at that moment, both people high favorability ratings. The election came, and as it was approaching, there was an event where McCain was approached by one of his supporters in a crowd, a town hall meeting, and the supporter said something that was blatantly wrong. The supporter said that President Obama is a Muslim or is not an American citizen, and McCain instinctually, as the man that he was, did not have to hesitate, said, "Man, that's not true. You're wrong. He's an honest family man with whom I just disagree." Can you imagine President Trump saying anything like that? Frankly, can you imagine Governor Newsom saying something like that right now? I mean, it's not just a Trump problem. Trump may have exacerbated the problem in magnitudes, but we are where we are now. And this is all to say, this was 2008, so to me, this feels like the beginning of my career. I mean, if you're gonna be in journalism, you kind of have to stay positive. It doesn't feel that long ago. Frankly, I was interviewing elected officials on my radio station at a school since I was in my early teens. So I've been in journalism a while. It doesn't feel that long ago, and so it still feels accessible. There are no incentives, to use that word again right now, for someone to stand up, what we call in America, a profile in courage, and correct someone who would vote for them and then may not vote for them because you corrected them. I've never said this before, but I wonder if that woman went and said, "I'm not voting for this guy. I believe these lies, these smears against President Obama, then Senator Obama. I'm not voting for this guy." But it is the job of honest people to serve a cause, as Senator McCain loved to say, a higher cause than themselves. And he did that in that moment. And I think that the best recipe for repairing in this presentation the state of American democracy is intellectual honesty. It's something you don't hear about enough in newspapers or on TV. It's a term that's frankly frozen in time. People don't know what it means. Let's not talking about woke culture and the radical this or that. We'll talk about intellectual honesty and the importance of integrity in our discourse, integrity in our policymaking, integrity in our human relations. Those are the values that I think will preserve Chilean democracy, American democracy, whether you want to call it democracy or republicanism, that those are the values that are necessary to a community, to governing as a community. And that, in effect, is what democracy or republicanism seeks to preserve. We know the rest of that story is that the next 2 terms of President Obama's administration, at least ostensibly, were not the type of bridge building and unifying that he preached during his 2004 keynote address. And I don't think the history books have really come to fruition yet on whether or not that has more to do with an obstinate opposition or whether it has to do with President Obama taking a more insular or introverted approach to governing. I don't know the verdict of that. And I don't think name calling or shaming is the answer to that. What I do hope is that we recognize we're in a moment of time with a different incentive, and we can return to a moment of time with a different incentive. With that, I would really love to answer questions that you have. I thank you for your time, your patience, your interest. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I appreciate it, and I look forward to speaking with you more now. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Tenés que esperar un cachito, David, así te llevo el micrófono. David, y después para acá.
Hola, soy David, estoy en segundo año de Ciencia Política. Como usted aludió, la radicalización en el discurso es una tendencia previa a Trump. Algunos llaman a la nominación de Trump la muerte del eufemismo. Es solamente la parte radical de su partido diciendo lo que realmente quieren decir. Y sí, como usted dice, la vida y hay una división. Avance, noticias que llegan hasta acá es que el gobierno federal está entregando la Guardia Nacional de estados rojos a estados azules. Y como usted mencionó, el gerrymandering se está volviendo más pronunciado. Algunos podrían argumentar que con el fin de facilitar la posibilidad de que Trump se postule todas las veces que quiera. Eso, mezclado con la radicalización de la retórica, quizás no tiene tantas consecuencias profundas en la vida regular de los americanos, a menos que sean miembros de ciertas comunidades marginalizadas. Pero las palabras girando alrededor de los medios masivos y de las redes sociales fuera de los Estados Unidos son guerra civil, autoritarismo, balcanización. Y fuera de los Estados Unidos vemos esos conceptos más cerca de lo que jamás han estado en estos últimos años, por lo menos específicamente en los Estados Unidos. ¿Usted ve posibilidades reales? ¿Cuál es la forma de seguir en este momento para mantener la estabilidad democrática? ¿Usted cree que el establishment democrático, o el establishment demócrata, como está en este preciso momento, tiene la posibilidad de tener este fenómeno de raíz, o es solamente extender el descenso inevitable de este actor internacional democrático? ¿Puede el sistema bipartisano de verdad resolver este problema en constante descenso a su problema?
Yes, thank you. It is a downward spiral right now, right? That's the status quo. You use those words, downward spiral. It's the jugular. I mean, it's overwhelming. I don't blame anyone who wants to acknowledge that hard truth from the outset of any discussion about democratic discipline or reform in the system. So, you know, you've asked the right question. It's a question that, in order to believe the answer is yes, we can recover from the slippery slope, you need a lot of stakeholders. You know, you need people in media thinking about their job in a certain way. You need the political opposition thinking about their job in a certain way. So, I mean, you allude to the U.S. system. I think that both political parties have been, you know, super problematic in the way they've engaged in policymaking in different respects, which has created that void of good morale and, you know, enthusiasm for public service. So your question is rather broad. You know, you mentioned a few things like the deployment of military to US cities, and whether we consider that to be an increasingly adversarial relationship to democracy. I'm just going to focus on that because I think there's an association with what transpired here when you see the idea of the deployment of, military. I will speak, for myself in saying that I think that President Trump hosted a reality TV show. So this is like chips, a monopoly game with him, right? But we have a judicial system. But like I said, we have a federal and state system, the concept of federalism. And I do think that we in America still possess sufficient guardrails so that innocent civilians, right, are not going to end up murdered in a stadium. Right? I mean, that now, when you look at ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, right, and the contentiousness about the immigration debate, part of that has to do with the sensibility in America that for decades, the communities of undocumented people grew, and there was no rational immigration system. And that's both when it comes to the undocumented, individuals and the legal immigration in our country, that it's just a mess. I mean, there's been a consensus in America that it's been a mess for a long time. So the issues of corruption in what we've been exposed to about inhumane treatment of immigrants, whether they have legal papers or not, that's a real issue, right? That's a real issue in the American context. Whether it was the separation of families or the treatment of detainees. Now, I would say that is not the same as the deployment of the National Guard in Los Angeles or Memphis or whatever, and saying, well, I'm going to take all these citizens into a stadium, for whatever reason, and interrogate them. The way that has been channeled by this Trump administration has been focused on immigration and enforcement. Now, is there the possibility that you grow a radicalized militant state that then infects the whole of the country? It's a possibility. But I just felt the obligation, being here, where I am, in the sacred ground, in this beautiful country, to say to you that, which is that I fear for my country, as a lot of people fear for their countries and the survival of democracy, but I want to be intellectually honest about what's transpiring. And while President Trump talks on Twitter, X, like he wants to, line up his opponents in mug shots, that's not going on in mass. We're seeing the beginnings of a vendetta campaign, a vengeful campaign against his political opponents in the form of James Comey over the last 24 hours. So I don't want to give you the wrong impression that President Trump is a lot like President Nixon. And he's engaging in the same kind of political warfare of strategists, advisors. Thankfully, the citizenry as a whole, I don't think is in his crosshairs. Individual people who he feels wronged him are. Now, there's a slippery slope. It's extremely disturbing what's transpiring. Your question was more wholly about the survival, protection of democracy. And I think there are a lot of directions we can take that. But I will tell you all my firm opinion that the Democratic Party's problem in recent elections is that they put up candidates who were not merit-based. The American people said, whether it was Secretary Clinton, now I think she's a significantly intelligent person, but there were problems associated with her campaign, and certainly the idea of a second administration that followed a two-term president, and as if this was oligarchic or aristocratic and not sort of of the people. And likewise, the Democratic Party did not have for decades we've had primaries. They did not have a primary. It was deeply flawed judgment to think, oh, here's this aging president, and we just need to slip someone else in because she's vice president. But our system of government does not. The Democratic Party itself, and as a whole, a vice president succeeds a president, and the president's no longer able to perform duties. But as a candidate for office, that is the people's responsibility. And I will just say, to add to this, there are people both in the media and in Democratic political life who have the opportunity to present a more credible counter position to President Trump and Vice President Vance. For some reason, they've chosen not to present those people. In my mind, those people include the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. Those people include, as crazy as they sound, those people include Jon Stewart, the comedian. I mean, it's not a mystery to me that Donald Trump is president of the United States and Vladimir Zelensky is president of Ukraine. It's not a mystery. It has to do with the way people have learned and the way people have engaged with ideas in media over the last quarter century. So whether it's Jon Stewart or Jimmy Kimmel, these are actually viable people who could win elections and represent a counter position to President Trump. The Democrats have also failed miserably in alienating the populist wing of their party, whereas the Republicans, carte blanche, especially when it comes to immigration politics, have said, here's the keys to the kingdom of your party. The populists, in a lot of respects, increasingly run the show. The Democrats have not put forward a credible agenda that incorporates Bernie Sanders, who won tens of millions of votes of people who, for the previous cycles, had voted for people like Bill Clinton and others, but they see that there's something wrong with their country in terms of the exorbitant wealth and the hands of too few, which was actually something that President Trump himself campaigned on in 2016. So I would say that the answer to your question lies in the raw politics of identifying your agenda and pursuing it with authenticity and credibility, something that the Democratic Party for the last 10 years has failed to do.
Alexander, can we
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, no.
I hope by that
questions,
answer. Sure. More questions.
Yeah, more than one question.
Of course.
at a time.
I'll be more concise. Sorry about that.
Muchas gracias. Son tres preguntitas cortitas. La primera,
I don't know how to answer a short question. That was a long question. Three short questions. It needs a long answer. I'll try to be quick.
son cortas pero difíciles. La primera, en 2008 tú mencionaste la elección de Obama. Y Obama en Grand Park, en Chicago, da un discurso donde dice que todo es posible. Y la prensa tomó eso y dijo, llegamos al estatus de color blindness. ¿Qué pasó entre el 2008 y hoy con ese tema? Esa es la primera. La segunda tiene que ver con NBC. ¿Qué pasó en la esfera pública norteamericana donde tú tienes a un tipo que hace un reality show de Apprentice en NBC? Pero hoy día tenemos a ese mismo tipo siendo presidente, atacando a NBC. Y la tercera tiene que ver con la violencia. Estados Unidos tiene una relación, uno podría decir que la violencia es parte de la ecuación de la política norteamericana. Es parte importante de la historia de Estados Unidos. Tuvieron un presidente que lo mataron y nadie sabe que lo mató. Entonces, ¿por qué esa sensación constante de sorpresa frente a algo que pareciera ser estructural? Muchas gracias.
We have another question over there.
Okay, good.
So,
Should I just let those questions sit on their own? Yeah, they are tough ones, so I could just let them sit and listen next, but I'll try to be brief. Thank you. Excellent questions. So let me start where you ended. Yes, we had a civil war in America. There's no doubt about it. We had slavery. Many countries have had some form of slavery, economic or political prisoners. But I would say to you, sir, is that those assassinations that you allude to, again, there are conspiracy theories, but I mean, they lived in isolation of mentally ill people, like the people who killed Charlie Kirk and Melissa Bortman. I mean, people who, in my definition, and some of you may disagree with this, but when you start to take that idea that you have to be violent in a civil society, you're outside of the norm. So remarkably, the US, after years of construction, even with the formation of the KKK and terrorist organizations, persecuting Black people, formerly enslaved people, I mean, waves of anti-immigrant hate of every sect. Yes, we've matured a lot. So there's a history of violence in America, but in the last half century, at least domestically, in the way we engage with each other, it's very, it's much more contained to domestic incidents and gun violence massacres and inexplicable ones. Mentally ill people who get their hands on guns like that. But the idea that we had political violence in our country, I think, is overstated in the last half century. The 60s and 70s, you could maybe say the Black Panther movement, and of course, again, the segregationists, the modern manifestation of the KKK. So I would just disagree with your premise in the last question. I would very much agree with your premise in the second question about The Apprentice. The premise, but I would say that it's not so hard to understand. Kennedy was a good-looking guy. I don't know if maybe people used to find Trump to be a good-looking guy. I don't know. But the point is that the whole aura of celebrity, aristocracy, Trump Tower, I mean, this is part of American lore, Horatio Alger. He didn't come from rags. We know that Donald Trump didn't come from rags, nor did Kennedy. And for all those people who want to salute Kennedy, I recently watched Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and in the introduction, it talks about how Mr. Kennedy, Ambassador Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, JFK's father, was just appalled by Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. He thought it was, he wrote a sternly written letter to the entertainment chief. Fortunately, the American people liked the film, right? But the person in power there, or the father, who's, father of JFK was not present yet, but there has been a streak of intersection of the entertainment culture and the political culture, and who wins out? Expression of free ideas or people who have kind of unilateral authoritarian ideas? And Trump just took the idea that American politics is about theater. It's about whether you put on an image like, I want to elect Mr. Smith. It's a film about a young man who's a camp ranger who gets appointed to the Senate, and they think he's just going to walk around the building like, giving people candies or something, and instead he exposes the corruption of his fellow senator from the state of Illinois, I think it was. So, in any event, why The Apprentice? It was a show that millions of people watched. I watched The Apprentice as a kid. Yeah, I mean, so we believe, and most of us, when we watch Survivor, also Mark Burnett reality show, most of us, we disassociated with it at some level, like as we were watching it. But some people may not have, and they might have thought that this is the real world, and this is how things actually occur. So there's that dissonance and disconnect, but it's not a mistake to me. And for all of you here in the audience, if you want to read one book about America that will tell you the story of Donald Trump and why we have X and Twitter and Elon Musk, it's Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. Neil Postman is a media scholar and critic who basically predicted everything that's transpired. And if you want a Bible for American politics in the last quarter century, read Neil Postman, because he, clearly establishes the pattern that led us to lose context and the merging of what we call infotainment. So it's not really a mistake. Now your first question, Rosanna, I'm sorry, it's 3 questions, I gotta take all of them. What happened? It's still not clear to me we know what happened. And we know that some things that happened. For example, the Democratic Party had an opportunity to do universal health care. And Democrats, 2 or 3 Democrats, prevented there from being what we call a public option, Medicaid, Medicare for all, or, you know, the type of system that people have in the UK or Australia. I don't know as much about your healthcare system here. Bottom line is, I think that the way that the Affordable Care Act played out will go down in history as the most insipid event to which there were dominoes of reactions, because it was not his fault necessarily that every single Republican voted against the Affordable Care Act, but when you come into a new administration, and they also voted against the Recovery and Reinvestment Act, you come into a new administration and you just talked about kumbaya, let's get along. And then you kind of accept, look, this is the way it is. And I think President Obama has said things to that effect, like that he was naive, that he thought people could get along, or at least during the financial crisis that those people experienced in 2007, 2009, and the aftermath of that, that there were solutions that should be approached together collectively. When it came to the Affordable Care Act and the Recovery and Reinvestment Act, it was just bulldozing through, and maybe it had to be so. But to me, that's a large part of the explanation, and it also explains Bernie Sanders. Because if you had a genuine public option as Americans, and we're a rich enough country that we could have said, we could get the money out of healthcare. We're not going to let, what the Affordable Care Act essentially did was it gave the insurance companies ultimate power over, you know, the exchanges. So anyway, next question.
Hola, thank you. Una inquietud, el presidente Trump tiene todas las características que aquí se han repetido. Ha intentado censuras, desprecia con mucha facilidad a otros, ha estado atacando universidades, los migrantes, etc. A mí me llama la atención que la ciudadanía norteamericana reacciona poco, que no ha habido movilizaciones en contra, o muy pocas, algo hubo en Los Ángeles. ¿Hay miedo? Y si existe miedo, ¿de qué se trata el miedo?
Well, yes, I think I've shared the fear that I don't think we're intellectually honest. I also share the fear that we are myopic or have amnesia, the worst kind of amnesia. Your question reminds me of January 6th and the events of January 6th, and the fact that if President Trump could have engaged in what Pinochet and company did, right? I mean, if he could have hung Mike Pence like one of his supporters wanted him to, and open the Washington National Stadium and thrown the dissidents in there, I mean, you know, would he have? So, if we want Americans to wake up, that's the question that we'll present to them every morning when they wake up. You know, that answer is sufficiently concise, but I hope its point has been conveyed in a rather potent way. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, thank you.
I have 2 questions. I'm so sorry I cannot say this in Spanish. My Spanish is bad. Feedback from friends. My first question is: do you think Donald Trump will run for a 3rd term, even though it's not allowed by the Constitution? And second question: I don't know if you know the book "How Democracy Died" by Alexander Heffner. For the people that don't know what it's about, this book is about. It's about how democracies die today, while before they were dying in a blatant way as democracy died here with Pinochet. But today, democracies die more slowly. But with what happened on the recent days, such as the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel, that strongly threatens freedom of speech, or with the attack of the Capitol, that shows that he does not recognize the results of a democratic election. Do you not think that American democracy is already dying?
I think that you probably heard in my presentation the fear that it has destabilized, the reality that it has destabilized. So I would use that, destabilize, as the word as opposed to die. Yeah, I mean, I probably wouldn't go around here or anywhere, just say democracy, American democracy is dead or is dying. There are people who have used that discourse, but I don't think that that's necessarily true or effective. There are ways in which democracy has both been exploited and defeated in some contexts. Simply stated, if you mean democracy in terms of majority rule, we had Supreme Court appointments over the last 10 years by President Trump who did not win the popular vote, right? So I'd like to reduce your question down to its most applicable form, which is you had a president in 2000 who didn't win the popular vote. You have a president in 2016 who didn't win the popular vote, who both got to make Supreme Court appointments. President Bush ultimately won the popular vote in 2004 and then got to make appointments with the popular vote mandate. But yeah, I mean, it's a deeply troubling thing. We in the United States consider the Supreme Court the law of the land and it's not a question of direct democracy or not democracy. It's an anti-democratic idea that, look, these judges were appointed by someone who didn't win the popular vote. Now, I said it's about to the first gentleman's question, it's about the imagination of a political party to say, look, we have this electoral system. It's hugely complex, even convoluted, and maybe it should be reformed, the electoral college, but that's the system we have, and that's the system we work within. So, you know, Hillary Clinton did not win that. Kamala Harris did not win that. That's a problem of their political campaigns. And it's ultimately a problem for the nation if we think that it's okay for 3 justices of a 9-justice Supreme Court to have been appointed by, in the case of President Trump, someone who lost the popular vote and fairly significantly compared to the 2000 election with George W. Bush. So in that respect, democracy is very much dead, right? I mean, if you believe in direct democracy, and I'm not suggesting judges should be appointed, but I think judges should be appointed by people who win a plurality or a majority of the vote, not a minority of the vote, right? So I think with respect to the 3rd term, it's unconstitutional. Republicans have loved to talk about the Constitution for years and years and years. I mean, I love to talk about the Constitution too, but then they go and do things that are increasingly unconstitutional. Whether it was the way the Muslim ban was enacted, the travel ban in the first Trump administration. I mean, I'm a New Yorker. I know what a national security threat is because I lived in New York on 9/11. I know that when countries from which the hijackers were from, that when that was omitted in a plan ostensibly to prevent terrorism from happening in the United States, I did a bit of a double take, right? Is this about politics? Is this about national security? So President Trump is not allowed to run for a 3rd term. If the Democrats don't perform well enough in the coming midterm election, I remember the map when people did a kind of shock and were shocked and awed about how poorly the Democrats were performing in 2016, and like the fear about Trump taking more authoritarian control of the government. It is a real possibility that state legislatures could be ruled in the majority. There are 2 ways to revise the Constitution and add constitutional amendments or start a constitutional convention. And the Republicans are closer in many states than they were in previous times to be able to do that. So it's possible that the Republicans could be closer than they are today to revising the Constitution after the midterm elections. I think it's unlikely that they would have that power. So then the answer to your question is no. Because between 2026 and 2028, if the elections do not occur at the state level to enable a constitutional convention or amendment to be written, it's not possible. But then there's possibilities that you're intuiting that he could just break the law and just say, I'm running, I don't care what the Constitution says. I don't think that's possible in America right now. I think it's possible that the law could be amended. But I don't think that, I mean, and to the professor's question about what's happened to American protests, for the right cause, on the right issue, the American people stood up and said, after the massacre at the high school in Florida, we care. And I was, and people I know were present and witnessed that March for Our Lives. That was a really substantial grassroots movement. I think, it's like, vamos a decir que no, right? I mean, it's like, you need the special sauce of the message and the messenger, and boy, there was a period where I just loved watching those commercials. I mean, and that was some political consultants worked too, and I think they were paid for that. They weren't paid after, before the plebiscite, they might have been paid after the plebiscite. The point is that Vamos a decir que no is a moving thing, as was the March for Our Lives and the advocacy of the students who literally watched their peers killed at that high school. So, movement making is possible when you wake up enough. And I think that in the event that Trump said unilaterally, I'm going to run for a third term, the Constitution hadn't been amended, I don't think that he would be able to withstand that.
Teníamos prometida una última pregunta que ojalá sea breve y sé que algunos de ustedes tienen clase, así que si necesitan retirarse no hay problema, entendemos. Y sería la última pregunta.
Thank you, everybody, and please stay in touch if anything I said interests you. Alexander Heffner, that's English and Spanish. You can look me up, write me if you want to stay in touch about anything related to the lecture or politics here in the United States. Thank you for coming out today. Yes. Sir.
Yo, sería un gusto conocerlo. Me llamo Carlos, también soy de ciencia política de segundo año. Y algo que quiero hacer énfasis, la pregunta que quiero hacerle es sobre la política partidista y la partidista que está teniendo Estados Unidos actualmente, porque es bien conocido que el sistema bipartidista de Estados Unidos ha estado bien estable a lo largo de toda su historia, porque tanto el Partido Republicano como el Demócrata han estado en Estados Unidos por más de 100 años. Y no es como en otros países donde los partidos mutan a cada rato, nacen otros, mueren otros. Y no es un secreto para nadie que a lo largo de toda su historia, especialmente en la Guerra Fría, ha habido colaboración o momentos muy intensos. Pero últimamente, por ejemplo, el asesinato de Charlie Kirk o lo que ocurrió en 2021 con el asalto al Capitolio y demás, la relación entre el Partido Demócrata y el Republicano se ha ido deteriorando. Y lo que quiero preguntarle es, ¿qué es lo que cree usted que va a ocurrir a futuro? ¿Cómo puede evolucionar o involucionar la relación entre el Partido Demócrata y el Partido Republicano? Porque algo que es muy destacable es cómo Trump se ha popularizado dentro del Partido Republicano, al punto en que, si puedo poner un ejemplo, ataca bastante a Joe Biden, al punto en que hace poco inauguró un paseo de la fama del presidente, no sé si en la Casa Blanca o algo, donde cada uno tiene un retrato. Y Biden tiene un retrato burla entre los dos retratos de Trump. Entonces, al punto en que inclusive siempre lo llaman Sleepy Biden. Por eso es algo que quiero hacerle. ¿Cómo cree que va a evolucionar?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your kind words about the lecture, and pleasure to meet you as well. Again, the Democratic Party put itself in the vulnerable position to have a president who used the auto pen. You talk about the walk of shame, the walk of fame, and shame. I mean, it's the Trump supporter, and we have friends who are Trump supporters, and I say this in a personal and journalistic capacity, right? Would say like Biden put himself in this position by using the auto pen to be mocked and ridiculed this way, right? I mean, you talk about the photos and the way they put the photo up with the pen instead of him. I mean, this is Donald Trump and his infantile paralysis of just, I mean, the American political life is like a play set for him. I mean, this is what he does, right? So that's not a partisan statement. It's like a statement that you do something that is questionable. He is if anything a kind of political animal machine, and he's going to politicize everything. So he was politicizing the use of the auto pen there. And I just want to state those facts because it reveals the way that the Democratic Party, and in this case President Biden, put themselves in a position of vulnerability to do something that then could be mocked and ridiculed in that fashion. No, that wasn't your question, but I just wanted to state that. With respect to the two-party system, I think the observation that I would make is that it's extraordinary that America has a two-party system, and so many people, and such an established two-party system, like you said, and so many people, even though they vote for candidates in that system, feel like they don't belong. I mean, it's a rather extraordinary thing. And I would just say that there has been a market for many years for more independent candidates of the kind that Ross Perot represented in the 90s, and they flamed out or just had not had the mission, the sense of mission, or the right spokespeople to carry forward. Let me ask you if there is there more of a particular question here before we go. I feel like I responded to what you said, but I'm not sure I answered any one question that you had. So just before we go, if you have a follow-up, I'm happy to listen. No? Well, sometimes you all have shared and explicated so much of your questions that it's hard to track the giving me helpful context. But I'm happy to talk to you after too, if you have a question you want to ask more directly. Thank you again for your time this morning, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ahora.
No, it's great. Stephen, you asked Stephen there for Obama was elected soon.
Y ahí la cosa yo cuando estaba, bueno, ese fue mi error. Dale un mensaje. Sí, la tenemos ahí. Pero
My question is about the system, because I saw with my
So I did get at what you were talking, the three part, the idea that the
the problem with this the violence for the murder of the child care and the democratic
I would differentiate between January 6th and 3rd. You know, because I think when you're talking about Kirk, you're not talking about one person pulled the trigger. In January 6th, it was a whole delegation that came to, and President Trump said, eventually, he said, turn back, and people did listen. Anyway, I think they're different, is my point earlier in the presentation, that when one mentally ill person murders someone, it's not a political message or movement. When you take a process of government and interrupt it in the way that's, to me, it's different. You know, those two things.
It is different, you're right. I don't know if you've researched the way in which, what's the name of the group he belongs to, is a group that generated 4chan of the it's a very stupid way, but it's a group of neo-Nazis.
Right.
And basically he killed Kirk because he was too not further enough in the right of the pieces that they have.
But my point is this.
Yeah.
My point is, these people are kind of inscrutable. Look at Lee Harvey Oswald, right? Let's stop trying to figure them out. They're kooks. I mean, that's not gonna, to me, that's not gonna solve anything. In my opinion, right? I mean, if you want to solve something, take the gun access.
No, y había unos de periodismo
Ability
también.
to protect the Capitol building from a protest,
No,
right?
pero.
That's just not
Sí,
good.
sí.
Yeah, for sure, but like,
Sí, no, sí,
I
claro,
don't know if
lo que
we
pasa es
should
que
like
suspendieron las ayudas
not
que
be
había en
worried
este
about the
horario
groups
para que
that are
vinieran. Lo que
generated.
pasa
No,
es
I'm
que
worried
la
about
hacía
that.
siempre
I'm worried
primero
about
I'm very
postulante
worried. I've been worried for years
a clase.
from
Entonces,
QAnon,
le
you know,
dice,
QAnon,
venimos
of
a la
course.
ayuda,
Yeah,
vengan a
QAnon is
esto
now
y
in the
el
government, in
Sí,
Congress, in the
yeah,
Senate, and
it's
that's
true.
an
Igual que
issue
nosotros.
because people didn't take them seriously enough
No, ese es
years
compromiso
before.
así.
And
Sí, yo encuentro que
I
son
appreciate that.
normalmente hacemos, o sea, como se programa para que la gente de
Oh,
del
sure.
Heffner se
I'm really
programa.
following your answer. So-
Es que
It's
eso
a
lo
pleasure.
vamos a
Thank you
hacer.
so much.
Claro, nosotros hacemos lo mismo. Por eso no son claro. O sea, yo cuando tú la mañana, yo le pregunto a la gente de literatura, le digo, ¿tiene este escritor? ¿Para qué?
You have a phone, I'll
Me
take
dice,
one
no sé, narrativa latinoamericana, ya, listo, ahí, y lo ponemos en eso horario.
Maybe,
Entonces,
Rosado, you mind taking a photo with all of us?
Sure. With your cell phone?
I'm gonna listen. Here, come stand here.
Antes de ver con la luz, los apply here, from here. Great. The only problem is that you have a six over there.
Thank you.
Realizadas hace también.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day. Have a great stay tomorrow.
Gracias, David.
Un placer.
Chao.
Have a nice day.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Chao, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Luis.
Gracias.
So we can go to lunch.
Oh, I was gonna say.
I
Dan,
imagine
think
you're
he's
very
got cola, he's got cola.
stomach.
Brilliant,
Diet.
brilliant food.
Yeah.
Ceviche.
So, let's go.
Okay,
Full
great.
house.
Gotcha.
Sí.
Oh, you
Rockstar.
said, knowing you're an American, you're gonna have a very huge appetite after this talk.
En fin, yo pensé que vamos a tener paseo. Vamos a tener que organizar un picnic. Bueno, vale, pero tú manejas. Chao. No me gané con la botera.
No, si me encanta,
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Igual me pago mi lata, así que me da. Que estés bien, nos vemos.
Quedando botella.